Well, I have the pleasure of introducing people who are probably pretty well known to most of the people here already. But just in case there are a few who don't know, Aaron Shaw is an assistant professor here at Northwestern. He got his PhD at UC Berkeley in sociology. His co-author is Mako Hill. Associate, I promoted you already. Assistant professor. Wouldn't it be nice if it were that easy? At University of Washington after doing his graduate work at MIT. And most of us know that these are the two, as Nash noted, are the sort of the brains behind bringing together this particular group of people that they thought would generate some really interesting and innovative thought. So we thank you very much for your conference visioning, and we're looking very much forward to your intellectual visioning in your own talk itself. And I thought it would be interesting, I looked through their background and research and find out that in the terms that Jeff was talking about earlier today, they actually have reused their co-authors several times. They are co-authors on 4 different papers together. So far, at least as far as your 2014 Vita anyway. So they've, in terms of reuse, they've done replication of their partnership. And they've done customization by adding other co-authors, such as Yokai, among the mix. And hopefully they're now going to help us to actualize that third purpose of innovation. Thank you. Hand over to you. Do you want this?
No, I've got one. I think I'm mic'd. Does that sound okay? Yes. All right, great. Yeah. No, I'm just going to put it over here. I'm just going to help. All right. Thanks so much, Janet. Mako's going to have his tenure committee call you in a few weeks, a few years. So don't worry about that. So this is a talk that Mako and I reflects collaborative work. I drew the short straw, so I'm doing the talk. But we've done a lot of work together, and it's really fantastic to be able to share it with all of you. Which actually brings me to my starting point. Which is that before we start, I just wanted to take a chance to really thank all of you. This has been a really, really fantastic experience, getting the chance to work with Nash and Janet and Peter, and sort of at a very long distance, Manuel, to organize the event, and to be able to work with Leslie on this too has been fabulous. And I think, in some ways this reflects a kind of dream conversation that's been going on, I think, in our heads and in our papers and in our conversations about this material for a number of years. And to be able to see it realized with all of you in the room is really an extraordinary thing. So thank you for coming here and for making this happen. So what I'm gonna try to do in this is really start by kind of maybe actually just exposing a little bit of that conversation that has been going on in our heads about this topic as a way to sort of situate where we think the work on peer production connects up with some of the themes of network theory that have motivated the original organization of this event, and to situate our own work in that and the work of many of the people in this room in relation to those themes. I'm going to present sort of an ongoing study that's motivated by some of the concerns and some of the challenges that we see. And it was interesting, I think you'll see some overlaps in some of the challenges that Charlie identified a few minutes ago, and the ones that I'm going to talk about. And then to kind of in a similar vein to Charlie, try to close with some thoughts about things that we see as open challenges or problems that we haven't solved in any way, shape, or form that we really hope the rest of you will have great ideas about so we can try to implement them. So part one, a few reflections. So the reflections that I'm going to tell you about really come out of a book chapter, which, as we just learned from MIT Press, should be coming to fine bookstores near you in a couple of weeks. It's a handbook of collective intelligence, and Yokai invited us to sort of work with him on writing a chapter which has this title, Peer Production, a Form of Collective Intelligence. But what a lot of the chapter is a chance to, we really start with basically the same definition that Charlie threw up on the board a few minutes ago that came out of the other work that Yokai had done, and try to elaborate that and really think through, kind of synthesize the body of literature in the social sciences around that. And so what we organized the chapter around and what we sort of found were these 3 central concerns or puzzles that had come up in this work. And this is work that cuts across a variety of different fields, everything from organization science, management science, information systems, human-computer interaction, sort of sociology, political science, right? I mean, we pulled together a lot of different stuff for this. Really tried to think broadly. The first of these is around this area of motivation, right? So this is this kind of fundamental question that really bothered a lot of economists when free and open source software first started, which is why the heck are people doing this, especially when they're not getting paid, right? The second area is quality, right? How are they doing this and producing something like a web server that can compete with the products of a multinational corporation, for example. And last but not least, this question of organization, which is how are they doing this, right? What are the sort of organizational structures and mechanisms and dynamics through which these outputs are generated? And I think this last area is really one that Mako and I have really focused a lot of our attention towards in terms of our research that's happened so far and that we're working on now, and that I'm going to talk to you about in a minute. But I think it's also the area that probably best exemplifies the sort of overlap of the different communities that are in this room. Right? I think there are a lot of ways in which when you want to talk about network dynamics and you want to talk about teams and organizations and how these kinds of systems function as knowledge production or innovation kind of generating processes, there are different kinds of answers and different kinds of approaches to this kind of question. So I think that's where we wanted to sort of take the conversation, right? And I think it's also worth pointing out before I bail on this slide so I don't get taken to task for it in a few minutes, is that we didn't intend this to be exhaustive, right? This is not sum up the entire universe, but I think to us we saw this as the three puzzles that have motivated really, really rich and broad areas of work in this domain. And so I think hopefully we can kind of continue to advance that. So okay, so when we dug in a little deeper, right, and just to continue to give you a flavor of what we tried to say in this chapter, we started categorizing within these three areas that there was sort of early stage work on peer production systems and more recent work. And the early stage work, we identified a few different characteristics of it, right? Much of it done by people in this room or people who you've collaborated with, right? Tended to be more descriptive and more exploratory, right? What is this thing? How does it operate? What's going on? And tend to focus on a small number of fairly extraordinary projects, right? Wikipedia being the most obvious kind of example. But a few other big free software projects as well attracted a lot of early attention. And a lot of this early work really relied on stylized facts, right? If you think about the sort of folk wisdom about peer production, the stuff that sort of, Eric Raymond's comments on the topic have come up a few times today, right? With enough eyes, all bugs are shallow. The early stage of work was really trying to explain how that worked in practice, what that actually looked like substantively, as opposed to sort of really starting to dig deeper to sort of question it or ask detailed, in-depth, sort of test it more rigorously. So the more recent work, maybe not surprisingly, has turned to really do more comparative analysis, I think, across lots of projects. Right, and I think you saw that Charlie and Bob's book was one of the first sort of big scale examples of this that I encountered. To try to compare across more than 100,000 free software projects, right, was taking this to a whole other scale to try to do more inferential work, really drawing on theoretical traditions in well-established domains to try to understand and test both stylized facts and classical theories in these spaces, right? And so this is where I think we've started to see deepening connections with existing research domains, right, that have emerged and strengthened, especially as a lot of you have kind of become more sort of senior figures in your respective fields. I think this has made it so that it's no longer a question, right? I think Kai brought up, right, we would have all been laughed out of the room in 1996 if we had started saying that this is an example of a certain kind of organizational process. But now I think it's no longer a question that this is in the domain of organizational research, right? So I think that's important. So, and yeah, just that last line that a lot of this work has been done by people in this room, and I think that was why this doesn't contain citations, because if we had tried to fit them all on this slide, it would have been ugly. So. So okay, so what about some open challenges? I think in terms of open challenges that we've been working on trying to address, we've been trying to work at this intersection of a few different problems. One is I think that the comparative analysis that's been happening has been fantastic, but a lot of it hasn't been able to combine, integrate comparison with something like causal identification. Right? So there have been lots and lots of experiments in the area of research on motivations that have looked to understand why would individuals edit Wikipedia, for example. Right? Very little that's tried to do this at the scale of organizations or systems or communities or larger networks. And also a lot of the experimental work and work that does do causal identification has had to happen in lab studies, has had to happen with simulated systems for completely reasonable and understandable purposes. And often because that's the first place you start. I think we saw a great example of this in Ulrika's talk this morning, right? Where when you want to sort of elaborate a detailed mechanism and understand a causal dynamic, there's no better place to do that than a lab. Right? But then, just as she did, I think for us, a lot of this has been an effort to say, okay, well, let's take what we've learned from lab studies and try to see what's going on in these large-scale field settings. So that brings me to the part 2, which is this example study. And this is just a working title. But we've been working on this paper we've been working on the analysis for this paper since like this past winter, really, in earnest. And apologies in advance, there are a few people in the room who have sort of seen earlier versions of this. So hopefully you liked it. And if you didn't, I apologize again. This is a study that we're calling the hidden costs of requiring accounts. And let me tell you a little more about it. So the background for this study really comes out of a combination of the sort of earlier stylized facts around peer production and the practice of one big community in particular, which is Wikipedia. Right? So Wikipedia has this persistent problem where they get vandalized, often, most frequently by anonymous editors. And at the same time, Wikipedians have long maintained that they want to have no barrier to entry, right? No requirement that anybody has to create an account. Right? And the arguments around this sort of boil down to this point that any sort of barrier, any sort of obstacle to making that drive-by edit, to fixing that comma, is going to drive some people away. Some guy who you might have heard of also has pointed to this as an example of how low transaction costs may have been one of the things that underpinned the early success of Wikipedia. Right? And there's been some follow-up research that's really supported this, including some work by Mako to look across a lot of different projects that were trying to create sort of free and open encyclopedic content, and finding that a number of the people who created those projects really felt that one of the biggest and most important differences between their projects and Wikipedia was this lack of a barrier to entry. Right? So in talking about that research, Mako actually went and presented this at a company, Wikia. And a guy came up to him afterwards, this guy, Danny Horn, who now works at the Wikimedia Foundation, actually, and who is a really active administrator within a very large wiki community. And he said, that thing about barriers to entry and account creation, I don't think that's quite right. And Danny sort of started talking through it with him, and Mako distilled Danny's points into these. He said, Danny was basically saying, look, we know that most of the vandalism is from anonymous editors, right? And that's true, right? There was no kind of arguing with him on that. We know that most of the high quality contributions come from registered contributors, also true. And we think that good faith contributors will take the few extra seconds to create an account. This is where we kind of went, well, maybe, right? That's an empirical question. Danny, happily, had some data about this and actually had some kind of qualitative evidence. Now, don't even really try to read the table. Right? All of us have been putting up tables that we don't want you to read today. It's kind of funny. But what had happened is that within a number of wikis hosted by this firm Wikia, where Danny worked, and where he was an administrator on one of their wikis, a number of them had blocked anonymous editing, right? Like the day before, anybody could edit without creating an account, just like Wikipedia. They implement this block, and the day after, you have to register in order, right? You can create a throwaway account. It's a really simple thing. I'll show you the login window in a second, right? But you just have to create an account in order to make any kind of edit. So Danny went and gathered some data from these, and he saw a pattern which looked like they were getting the decrease in vandalism that they hoped for, and that they were getting either consistent levels of contributions or an increase in contributions in some cases, right? Danny brought this to Mako's attention and very, clearly and graciously said, look, I'm not a statistician, right? Like, you guys should take the data and go figure this out, right? So Mako's eyes got really big, and he sent me an email, and that was like a year or so ago, and here we are. So, I think part of this, though, is that Danny's intuition doesn't just reflect the sort of wisdom of a community manager. It actually reflects a lot of really deep and robust social scientific work. And I'm going to grossly simplify a lot of that for a second here, but just bear with me. So the question is, like, what would account for the idea that this account creation process would actually help support the production of public goods? So the narrative would go something like this, that by creating accounts, you're helping people create stable reputations, right? These reputations make people more accountable, they help generate trust, and they help generate identification with the community and with those people in it. And that those things, that second row, accountability, trust, and identification, all lead to increased contributions to communal public goods. Right? And this goes to a whole variety of research. I did include some example citations in this slide. You can take me to task later and tell me which ones I need to add. But I think this reflects work from a bunch of different disciplinary backgrounds, right? Including including a bunch of different stuff ranging from exchange theory to HCI to organizational communication, right? All over the map. Now, there's maybe a more nuanced version of this. Paul Resnick has been involved in some work where he said that there's maybe a more complicated interplay between contribution costs and the amount of cost you have to impose to drive away vandals, but not drive away the good people, right? So maybe there's some sort of sweet spot, I think, is the suggestion from that work. But the point is that there are at least these kind of two broad schools that would seem to contradict in terms of their predictions empirically. And contradict in a way that really addresses a concrete problem faced by communities. So, we saw Danny's kind of cases here as an opportunity to really test it, right? So we decided to try to address these questions, right, with this study. So we're looking at these to see what happens when wikis require you to create an account. And we wanted to see how much damage and vandalism seems to go away, right? How much bad stuff never happens, as well as how much good stuff is never contributed, right? Because there are both of these sides of the questions, and they're different sides, right? And so what we did is over the last few years, we've built a data set out of Wikia wikis, right? And so Wikia is a really large. It's a company that hosts wikis. They have many, many wikis. They're all publicly editable. Many of them are extraordinarily large. They use MediaWiki, which is very helpful. And they're not part of the Wikimedia Foundation. They were founded by people who were involved in Wikipedia, Jimmy Wales among them. But they sort of work in parallel in some ways, right? And if you go and visit their wikis, it'll look really familiar to you if you're familiar with the user interface of Wikipedia, right, or any media wiki for that matter.
Yeah, there's a little bit of confusion in terms of terminology, right? MediaWiki is the software
that
MediaWiki is the software that Wikipedia runs, which is shared. Wikimedia is the organization that runs Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is Wikipedia.
Yeah, they should have called somebody. Somebody really thought this through very carefully before they named all of this stuff.
But the key point is that they all use software which is identical to each other, and also the same software which is used in Wikipedia, which is actually a really useful thing for people in this room who have done work on Wikipedia and who might be interested in doing work in other communities. There is this, or doing comparative analysis, or doing across organizations, or simply just testing for things you've established in Wikipedia and other communities. Very often, the software that you write to parse or build, to pull data from Wikipedia will work without any modification in these Wikia wikis as well. So
yeah, thanks for adding that. Yeah, I mean, it speaks to a question that Charlie raised, I think, which was, what do you do to get it to kind of find ways to identify and analyze common organizational or governance features within these kinds of environments? And I think a few of us have come up with different solutions to this, right? Looking at projects or sub-communities within a larger community is one. Looking at communities across a common platform is another. Right, and so these are just kind of to give you a flavor, right? These are front pages from a few of these wikis. If you can't read that, there's one that's on Starbucks. There's one called Wikipedia, which is all about Star Wars. There's Academic Jobs Wiki, so the grad students in the room, you might want to, get on that. But after the talk. And then there's Hunger Games Wiki, right? So we're talking about a range of topics. There are a lot of them that are about sort of popular culture or fan culture type communities. But again, you can see they all sort of look similar. They all sort of look like Wikipedia, and that's not an accident. They're all running the same software. So our data set includes all of the edits from all of the editors to a large number of these wikis. Here's what the login page looks like for these, right? It's not so crazy. If you click sign up, it's not like you have to enter a lot of personal data. You just need a username and a password, right? They can be throwaway accounts. It's very quick. I'd estimate that it takes you maybe 30 seconds if you want to go through this, right? I mean, that's, I don't know. We'd have to, we'll test it later.
Maybe.
We can do a test with
everyone.
everyone.
There's no email confirmation.
But yeah, there's no email confirmation. There's no real like authentication step going on. So in case you're thinking this is like actually a secret like high bar to entry, it's not. Very low. And so to analyze these, I think the way we've been thinking about these, and we've been having conversations about this, so we'd love feedback, is, so we've got 136 of these wikis that blocked contributions from unregistered editors, right? One day you could just show up and edit. The next day you had to create an account or log in. And so we structured this as basically a panel regression discontinuity. And the idea with regression discontinuity is that you take advantage of some sort of exogenous shock that happens. Some people are nodding their heads. Some of you might not be familiar with this. It's totally cool. But the basic idea is that it's like a natural experiment or a quasi-experiment. And the idea is that there's some external thing that changes the operations of a system, and we take advantage of that to try to draw inference around the period immediately before and immediately after. Right? So for this, what we wind up doing then is we're doing within wiki comparison. Right? We're estimating based on the contributions coming into a wiki. And the unit of analysis we're looking at is a week of contributions to each of these wikis, right? So it's a wiki week. So we're doing within wiki comparisons of wiki weeks, and we're looking 3 months before and 3 months after this change to generate our estimates. But most of the power of the inference, and really the place where our estimates have the most traction, is in the week right before and the week right after, because that's where the change happened, right? Once you get further out, you start drifting into this world of, well, we don't know exactly what was going on at the time around these communities, so we just try to model it to try to take account of those kinds of secular trends in the data over time. And then, so like I said, right, we're trying to estimate the effect on the measures of damage and quality, regardless of who is contributing. And this is important because we're talking about anonymous contributors, right? You've already heard from one of the earlier talks that it's, I think Ulrika was mentioning this, that you can't track effectively, right, who's contributing from which IP address over time. So in order to look at this, what we need to do is we aggregate the incoming contributions to the entire wiki over the course of each week, and we sort of estimate the good stuff and the bad stuff within that aggregate, right? And then we look at that with the anonymous contributions and without. So that's an important point for the purpose of the analysis. Okay. So I'll get into some measures and some results. So our measure of damage here, and we've gone back and forth on this, so Yokai, we can continue this conversation that we started in Boston a couple weeks ago. But our measure of damage that we're going to focus on for right now is reverted edits, right? And these are edits that are basically, if I make a contribution and Mayo shows up on this page of the wiki and she thinks it's bad, she can just revert my edit, which is basically saying she takes my edit and removes it, and the page goes back to the state it was in right before I showed up. So in many ways, it's kind of a conservative measure, right? Because Mayo might change my edit, and at the same time, she might add some stuff to make the article like really better, not just kind of like worse, like I did. And if she does that, if it doesn't match the state of the preceding edit, we don't count it as a revert, right? So this is a conservative measure of only times when people come along and they just undo the last thing that was done.
Well, they could have undone multiple things. That were
that's true too.
So.
Sorry, yeah. So they could have undone, Mayo could have undone like my edit and Mako's edit, and then we'd be fine. So that's our measure of damage. And I'm just going to show you, for better or worse, we don't have a pretty way to visualize these results. But we've got so I'll give you a very small and brief regression table. So brace yourselves. Sorry, ready? There it is. All right. So this is the regression result. So basically, what we're looking at here then is the coefficient on the block, right? This is it's like there is no block, and then right at the week where the thing changes, that's when the block becomes a 1 in the regression model, right? And what you see is this nice negative coefficient, and that's a standard error. It's wildly significant. And when we sort of turn this into marginal effects, or words that humans can understand instead of regression models, we find that the probability that there will be any reverted edits, right, goes from being about 70% in the week before the change to about 15% in the week after, right? So that's a decrease in over 50% in the probability that you'll have any of these bad things coming in that need to be removed.
And the reason the table is so small is because these are within wiki estimates.
Oh, yeah.
So there are fixed effects for every wiki in here. So these are all just looking at within community measures. So this is a, yeah.
Yeah, you don't want to see all those other coefficients. That would make the slide really ugly. OK. All right, so that's our story on damage so far. Let's go to quality. So we've got two measures of quality in this case. One is unreverted edits, right? So just think about if I made my change, Mayo comes by, and she doesn't delete what I did. That's an unreverted edit. So that's, again, a pretty conservative measure, right? That's just assuming that what I did didn't completely ruin things such that Mayo felt the need to delete it. And then we've got this other thing called persistent word revisions. So the idea here is the intuition behind this is pretty straightforward before I get into explaining any of this. The idea is that if I make an edit and it sticks around for a bunch of subsequent edits, right? If everybody at this table edits the same page and they all come by and none of them removes the text that I added, they're sort of at least passively voting for my content, right? They're kind of saying that your content's good enough to stick around, right? So the measure does is it takes an edit, right? Look at the table here. Apples are red. And it looks into the future. I forget exactly how many we did. 7, I think? 6? You can alter how many edits you look into the future. You look into the future a few edits, and we see how many words of that original edit are still around in the subsequent edits. And you count up how many edits each word survives for, and you get a number, and you call that the revision score, the persistent word score for my edit, right? This is work that Aaron Halfaker at the Wikimedia Foundation really built on top of some earlier stuff that Luca Alfaro had developed with some students of his. I think Jonathan Adler is his name, yeah. At UC Santa Cruz. And so we're using both their ideas and their software to implement this. But right, so persistent word revisions, stuff that sticks around when you're trying to create this kind of common textual corpus of knowledge, we're saying it tends to be a little better. That's the bottom line.
And so it's a measure of both. In this sense, it's a measure of both. Well, one, I like that this is the second talk with blue apples in it today.
It's true.
Which is kind of
that's impressive.
Interesting thing I noticed. But two, the important thing is that it's both a measure of quality in the sense that we're looking at text which has persisted over a period of time, but also productivity in the sense that if someone adds more and then most of that stuff sticks around, and it is on the level of the word or really actually the token. So if you add markup or other formatting changes, that is also stuff which will be tracked over revisions as well. That counts. Mm-hmm.
All right, so if you're with us on this, that's good. So these are both dependent variables we're going to look at, unreverted edits and the persistent word revisions. OK. So here's the first results. This is for non-reverted edits. And in here, what you're looking at, right, just to translate a bit again, so if you look at the x-axis, right, these are these wiki weeks. And these are weeks before and after the cutoff. The cutoff is at 0, which is that midpoint, right? And to try to help, we take the central tendency of the number of non-reverted edits within all the wikis, and that's the green line before the cutoff, and that's the purple line after the cutoff. And then we've given you a plot that sort of smooths out the aggregate measure there. The y-axis is log transformed, right? So what looks like a really tiny little jump between the two lines actually turns out to be a really huge change. I got to look at my slide here to remember what it is, but. So in an average wiki in our sample here, out of these 136 wikis, we were seeing 118 non-reverted edits in the week before the anonymous contributors had to register. And in the week after, it drops to about 85. Right? So 118 to about 85 on average. You can see there's a lot of variation. But all in all, that's about a 30% drop. And again, very nicely statistically significant. So here are the results for this persistent word revisions measure, right? So again, log transformed y-axis, that's our persistent word score. So the numbers, it's hard to really interpret the numbers, so you might just think of it as a scale. And again, x-axis is the same weeks, and you can see the trend before, the trend after. This jump is actually quite a bit bigger, right? So this is, we see again a large negative effect. In this case, it's about a 62% drop. Right? So that difference is about a 62% decrease. Like I said, it's not really worth trying to translate that back into a number of persistent tokens because that's not a meaningful thing for us to think about. But that's a huge decrease in terms of the number of things that were being added that were sticking around that are now no longer showing up after this cutoff. Last but not least, we actually looked at new editors, because if you think about the kind of arguments that people had about people creating accounts, we were curious whether, so like part of that story that I told you at the beginning is that the barrier to entry won't be a problem, right? The people who are committed will just register anyway. So we tried to look and see. So people who create an account and make at least one edit, right? How many of them are coming in the weeks before, and how many of them are coming in the weeks after? And so again, same kind of thing, right? Log transformed, weeks across the x-axis. This time there is a little difference between those lines. It goes from about 1.8 to about 1.3 average editors, new editors per week. And it's statistically significant. But step back for a second and think to yourself that you're creating a wiki, and I tell you that blocking unregistered contributors is going to lose you half an editor every week. You're probably not going to. That wasn't what you were thinking, right? For the people who thought that everybody would just register anyway, this does not support that story. Right? There's a slight bump, but it's not very large, and it's not really substantively important, I think.
Sorry, you said it went up or down?
I think it went up, excuse me. Yeah, sorry, that's probably a problem from the visualization because we're smoothing stuff. So it's getting tugged up a little bit right towards the point there.
It looks like it goes up starting a week or two earlier.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure what the story is there.
Did they announce we're going to have a policy change?
No. Yeah.
Was date week 0 the same for all 136 wikis?
You mean was it the same date?
No, every one of these were in different points.
Yeah,
in
they're
time.
wildly different points of time, which is actually a nice thing because it means like if I do this on Christmas and you do this on July 4th, right, whatever seasonality things were happening then, they kind of wash out. Yeah, Brian.
Have you done a spot check to check and see if your vandalism is actually conflict?
If our vandalism is actually conflict. We have not done a proper spot check on that. That's the kind of thing we should check out. Yeah.
Explain this, which is when you start to have conflict, you attract more people,
Mm-hmm.
and the reverts are happening not because of vandalism, but because one side says X and one side says Y, and they're reverting without doing anything.
So what we do see a lot of, that's an important point. I think what we do see a lot of in our spot checks, we haven't spot checked all the stuff to look for conflict. So that's something we haven't done. But when we do look at spot checks, what we do find is indications that a lot of these wikis are getting huge increases in vandalism of some sort, right? Basically anonymous contributions that are subsequently getting reverted in the weeks immediately before, suggesting that it could be something like an exogenous event, right? That's sort of driving attention to their community from people who aren't good faith contributors, and then they're locking the door.
And to the extent that some of these communities are fan communities, there are things that happen in the world that will like change underlying interest.
A new Harry Potter
thinking
book comes out.
Yeah, well, I mean, Harry Potter's not one of these, but
No.
I'm trying to. There are a bunch of fan communities.
A new
that would-
video game
And that's the kind
is
of thing
released,
that
right,
we
in
can
a
find
series.
separate model. We could find external measures of underlying interest and try to add that. That would be the kind of thing we could do.
The other thing would potentially make this a pitch of your story is newbies.
Mm-hmm.
You get a whole bunch of people in, and the experienced editors are reverting what they're doing out of hand because they've already had that discussion. They're not doing anything, and at some point they get fed up and walk.
They just said that.
Most of these wikis are relatively large. You do see increases. There's a couple in here that are very small. It's like they get one anonymous edit and like, we didn't like that, and they decide to like cut it off, right?
We're closing the door. Nobody else is let in.
Last time that happened.
Yeah. No, but I mean, these are exactly the kinds of things that I think we're looking to dig into in a little bit more depth. I mean, it's a challenge because we are talking about 136 of these, and a lot of them are very big, and it's a lot of edits. But 136 is not so large that you can't spend some time digging in.
So yeah, so I mean, like these were complete surprises to the anonymous contributors. There were examples of places where someone may have approached someone in Wikia or had a conversation about it, but the only people who would have seen that would have been administrators, basically, who were part of that conversation.
Yeah. Which conveniently brings me to my next slide, which is to say that we can do things like drop all the administrators from this. We can change the model specification. We can expand the window to include more days. We can shrink it to include weeks before and after. We can shrink it to include fewer. And whatever we do, none of this goes away.
I think the two that are, so one important thread is this idea of these placebo tests. So essentially, if we look in other periods of time, we don't see the same effect if we look 6 months before or afterwards, something like that.
Yeah, so that's this bit.
And
right?
then the second one is that we limit two newer contributors who are the people who absolutely,
for whom this was definitely an exogenous change that they were not expecting, right? Because it's an important thing. If everybody knew it was coming, then We're no longer talking about a
Get your
quasi-experiment.
vandalism in first.
Right, quick, vandalize now so you don't have to later. Yeah. So, in any case, we can dig into some of these in more depth if folks want to, but let me kind of keep going just to close off our thoughts on this. So again, right, to summarize, requiring accounts deters contributions. That's the summary finding here. We find that for good contributions and for bad contributions. Percentages are up there, so you can read them yourselves. And we find that few people make the effort to register new accounts. Right? So if you thought that everybody was just going to show up and sign up, even though they didn't have to last week, that just doesn't seem to really be the case. You get some increase, but not a very large one. So in the end, we take this away as really support for something like the did you have a question, Kevin? Or?
You reported all the other ones as change in probability. The new editors goes up by about, what, 48% or something? From 0.5 over 1.2?
Yes. Yeah, if you want to think of it that way, that's right.
40% increase in editors. Sign me up.
Sign you up. Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think that's, let me come back to that in 1 second. Yeah. All of this is?
No.
Well, I'd be careful about saying that, that this one is, these last two are good. These were contributions that were not reverted and contributions that were persistent, right? And those are going down a lot.
If the amount of content which is persisting on the wiki is going down by 60%, that seems like
You're losing a lot of good stuff.
That seems like a bad thing. And that was definitely not what they were hoping for. The people who made these changes were hoping for, or what they expected, or in many cases what they thought happened.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody
because
was really
it's hard
hoping
to see
that
what's
this would
not
happen.
happening.
Yeah.
Are these all still private or not able to be edited? Did they ever open it back up?
There were a couple.
Some of them did.
There were a couple that opened them back, but not enough.
We haven't
Yeah.
gone and looked the other way. Yeah.
There weren't enough that opened it up, and the ones that
I mean, we could,
The short, I mean, there were a few that were always that started out as closed, and there was some discussion about there was another change which has been made much more recently, so we could go back and look at this data now, which is that they essentially early on it was very hard to make this change. You couldn't just, if you were an administrator of a wiki, you couldn't just do this. You had to basically ask Wikia to make the change for you. And so, but they have subsequently made it much easier for people that are creating new wikis to set this, to make this change. And so you've seen
It's basically a
an
settings
increase,
panel now. You can toggle it.
So, but this is very recent, like in the last few months. And they were actually, they were actually considering turning this on by default for everyone. And then they invited us to come in, and they got word that we were working on this, and decided not to, at least immediately. So.
Yeah, interesting.
It's not exactly that they're closed. They're just not enough.
That's right.
Yes.
Anyone can still get an account.
Anyone can still get a
Yeah, that's
throwaway
right.
account.
Think of
That's
it.
right.
Think of it as like, anyone can spend a few seconds to type in an account. You don't even have to confirm an email. So they're not closed wikis. Wikia does not support. They only do peer production projects. There are lots of other wiki hosting firms that host private wikis that are used, for example, in schools. Wikia only hosts public peer production wikis.
Yeah. Before we open it up to more questions, I think I want to try to finish. Is that okay? Can you hold it for a few minutes? That would be great. I'll try to move through it fast. And we can come back to the slide and you can ask all the questions you want. So I think our takeaway from this suggests at least some support for the transaction cost approach and the transaction cost theories around this, right? I think, congrats Yokai, you were right. No, that's one way to think about it. But it also suggests that these barriers, right? I think that it really suggests that these barriers can enhance the signal of the incoming edits too, right? The vandalism goes down by a lot, right? And if you want to think about it as proportions, right? I think this goes back to your comment, Kevin, right? Maybe on balance, right? If you have a small number of good stuff, small amount of good stuff coming in, and a large amount of bad stuff, you might not care if you drop the little amount of good stuff a little lower. Right, in order to get rid of a huge quantity of the bad stuff.
I would say it also matters what the cost is of reverting bad stuff and what the cost is of reverting, because there's a sense in which if it takes you an hour to deal with every revert, right, then that marginal decrease in good contribution may not offset it if it means that although because we are looking, one power of that, we're looking at what happens on the wiki on average, right? So if, for example, the administrators now have more time because they're not spending other time reverting things, that would show up in the average effect on these wikis, right? This is the benefit of not looking at what happens to logged in people or any particular people, but to the community as a whole.
Yeah. This is to say that there is further analysis we want to do on this, and some of this does include looking more deeply to understand, both. I mean, we've talked mostly about the quantity of contributions, but we could talk more about qualities of contributions as well. And we could look more closely at sort of subgroup analysis, right, and look at some core contributors, folks who have been making high quality contributions, and understand the effect of this on them, right? So that the folks who were there before and who are there after, to understand, are they editing in different ways before and after. So I think the place that we close with this is really this question about whether it is a worthwhile trade-off, right? Is that half an editor increase worth it to you, right? Is the decline in good stuff coming in worth it to you, right? Is the cost of reverting, getting the bad stuff out, getting the vandalism stuff high enough or low enough, right? That there is no real clear, it's not obvious that there's only one way to respond to this, right? And it really depends on the context of the specific community and the issues that they're facing. I think we think that the study does some nice things in the sense that it really illustrates, at least I think it really illustrates the advantages of this kind of population level comparison and combining that observational kind of causal identification with that, right? So it gives us this nice thing about we have this enormous variation across all of these communities. We get nice standard errors around all of our estimates that don't just reflect sort of bootstrapping on the basis of the largest community, right? Which is sort of the typical way you might go about this historically. And we get some nice things around internal validity, at least if we can make a compelling case that this is in fact an exogenous shock. Can I keep? I'm like right on the edge. All right. So let's talk a little bit about limitations too before we finish up, which is that there is some challenges around this. There are some challenges around this with regard to the fact that our measures are pretty coarse, right? We're counting these things on wikis, and it's very hard for us to understand how editors are really experiencing these. And that there may be other kind of subcategories of projects, right? Different types of wikis may respond to this kind of change very differently, right? You can imagine that maybe this wouldn't be an issue on the Metapedia project involved with espousing Nazism, but maybe the wiki around your favorite TV show, this is a problem, right? I don't know. Which really brings us to this question about generalizability again, right? I think one of the strengths of this work is that it generalizes beyond the single largest wiki that lots of people have analyzed. But it sort of turtles all the way down. Right, like we can't say for sure exactly how this generalizes beyond Wikia. We can't say for sure exactly how this generalizes beyond wikis, right? And while the comparative kind of within platform comparison thing has solved a lot of problems for us, right? These problems with cross-platform comparison that I think Charlie was kind of pointing at before are still there, right? We don't know how this relates to Stack Exchange or the Zooniverse or any of that. And that's really where we have to rely on theories and kind of more comparative analysis across different systems to help us bridge those gaps at the moment. So some challenges to kind of close with. Good quasi-experiments are hard to find, especially ones that relate to interesting theoretical problems. And so I think that's kind of an ongoing thing. One possible way to kind of test theories in a causal sense across organizations would be to try to randomize things, but this is really hard to do. Right? It's hard to get buy-in from someone who runs a platform or the different administrators across lots of communities to all implement something in a randomized controlled trial, right? So that's a tough road to hoe. And that in many cases, platforms are controlled by firms which aren't eager to share data widely, right? So we're lucky in the sense that luck has something to do with it, but we've chosen to work on data sets where it's publicly available data that's licensed for this kind of use, right? And there are other communities like that, but sometimes your interesting questions don't happen in those spaces, and then what do you do? And I think that we can, this last point just relates back again to the idea that we have this exhaustive data, right? We have the full text of all of these edits. We're only scratching the surface still in terms of what we can do to understand more deeply what's going on inside the content of the contributions, as well as how that reflects potentially the experiences of contributors. And I think this is areas where, at least for both of us, we're working with some of the graduate students in the room to try to pursue projects that can start to get at this as well. So we'll look forward to their work in a few months or a few years. But for now, thanks very much, and let's open it up for questions. Yeah, let's go to Jeff, and then we had Kevin had his hand up a while ago, and Michael, yeah. I can just pass this back and forth. No?
Yeah, I think it's so powerful to be able to look at hundreds of these things and see these effects. And I want to play off of what you said toward the end, which is that there might be different types. And so, as an example, there might be the vandalism is rising, so the door gets shut type. And I'm wondering if you can use kind of match samples approaches to say, can we look at 30 of these that seem to have that characteristic, and another 30 that goes like flat, and see if you can start to untangle that. And that would be, because you can't, a randomized trial would be the best thing, but if you can't do that, then some kind of match sample might help.
We've talked a little bit about that, and that was a question that was also something that Yochai asked at the first time we talked about this work, and I think it's a great idea. And we haven't done it yet, but it's a great suggestion. There are challenges around doing the matching across these kinds of communities, and there are reasons to. Yeah, it doesn't get you like all the way there, but it would definitely give some fodder.
There's a lot of power that comes from doing the within. We gain a lot from doing within community, limiting our results to these within community changes. But talking about systematic differences between communities, there are still other ways in which we could do that by, for example,
matching.
Yeah, matching in various ways, and splitting the sample in different ways.
Yeah. I think we had Kevin, and then Michael. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so my question was actually a variation on what Jeff said, which was if the story you're telling of some exogenous event happening that drives interest, causing a bunch of people to come flooding in and creating problems, then it could be that part of the drop-off is just the event is over, people are starting to go away naturally anyway. And so being able to say, that it was flat before and it is definitely dropped off, versus it had been sort of peaking up and then maybe dropped off naturally. So again, trying to sort out what's going on differently with different reasons for having decided to block anonymous edits seems important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. I didn't have No, I think we're both nodding. I think that's right. And I think a complement to this would be to understand both the individual wiki histories as well as.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if it's only 136,
we could dig in more.
Able to dig up the reason for why they decided to.
Yeah, we've looked. It's
hard for
in some
of them,
cases
yeah.
we can find it. In others, like
some of these
all you
wikis are
see-
not really
all
around
you see, all you see
anymore.
is a request. One thing that's interesting is that we don't talk very much about the mechanisms here, but Andrea Grabati's done some great work that has essentially suggested that vandals, or maybe not vandals, she says newcomers, who are not very good at contributing to Wikipedia yet, actually have a positive effect in Wikipedia, not even when their stuff is completely removed, because their stuff is completely removed and the person who completely removed their stuff sticks around to contribute in other ways, right?
Like the story I told with, if Mayo sees that I made a bad edit, she might stick around and help that page because she finds some other problem there.
So there's
Andrea finds evidence that this does happen on a larger scale in English Wikipedia.
So there's a sense in which there's some evidence in which damage can lead to positive contributions, which when damage is removed may actually could result in a decrease in good stuff through that process. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but that is one potential mechanism.
Yeah. Do you want to go to Michael?
Yeah, great study, guys. This is terrific. Both I love the method as well as the particular hypothesis you're trying to test. It's really nice. Couple of questions. One, can you really generalize from non-authenticated non-anonymity to in other words, anonymity versus non-anonymous but unauthenticated to non-anonymity which is authenticated. That is to say, you get something back, an email that you have to click, and now you know that they can find you.
This one, there's no email.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's my point. So, in a way, somebody could argue that that the intervention here was to create the worst of both worlds, in the sense that there's a little extra work you have to do that's annoying, but it's not authenticating. It's okay, there's a name on it now, but it's a fake name. So if you have a continuum from no name to real name, where does fake name fall on that continuum? The implication here is you're placing it pretty close to real name, but other people might say, no, it should be closer to no name. And so, if you create a sort of an extra task that people have to do, but you haven't really gotten the benefit of reputation.
Right,
and
we
all
don't get
this-
to anchor all
I think
those
what
nice
we get,
things.
what
yeah.
we get here is persistent identity, and so we get identity which persists over time in a way
until
that,
I create a new login.
so you don't have to. Well, that's true. You could if you're like very bad at remembering your password, you could be
Or malicious.
or malicious.
Yeah.
You could avoid this in certain in ways that, but presumably that would show up in a smaller decrease in the amount of vandalism.
Potentially.
So there
Yeah.
is a whole literature which looks at the creation of persistent identities as distinct from connecting people to like their actual identities, which have a whole other set of accountability, for example,
right.
which is not part of this.
Good answer. Yeah, a good point. Can I just make a quick second point? Isn't there a difference between the people who were there before, who've experienced the anonymity condition, versus the people who come in after the change, right after the change? Did you check that to see if having, oh, wait, suddenly there's a change for the people who didn't know there was a change because they're just showing up?
Well, we don't, I mean, we don't look very deeply inside of the individuals before and after. I mean, we don't know, we have no demographic data, for example. I mean, we only know the edit history.
We know who's before. We know who's there before and afterwards. One challenge is that people have the users have particular life cycles, right? So the people who were there before, maybe I don't know, on the, I mean, generally speaking, probably on the downward swing, which I think is usually the
Could
way
be on the
this,
outs,
usually the way this will work on average at least. So I guess I don't completely understand. Maybe I don't completely understand what you're asking about.
So this is, would we see different types of editors before and after at a
Different
general
kinds
level?
of reactions to the change from the people who knew it was a change and the people
Yeah.
who didn't know it was a change.
But it seems to me that some of the people who came in afterwards, we don't know whether they are really new or whether they were just the people
That's
who were
true.
anonymous who were forced to
Who were
become.
forced to
That's right.
become.
So
Although we have a good guess because there aren't a lot of new accounts.
So part of one answer could be that like there's a sense in which part of the power, like there's a lot of complicated stuff going on here, and by looking at sort of wiki level effects or community level effects,
Yeah.
there's a sense in which we don't have to go into all of that because we just look at what happens from the provision of the public good. What we care about is whether or not the wiki's being, like whether or not the content is being contributed, whether this stuff is, are we going to have more stuff in the public good before or after, right? I mean, and so from that perspective, which I think is where we both approached this,
Yeah.
that sort of made sense. There's a lot of really interesting questions about mechanisms that I think we would need a harder handle. And the problem is that because it is just pseudonyms, right, and anyone can create one or abandon one, it's very hard to track individuals
Yeah.
before and afterwards in a way that
Yeah.
makes the organization, it makes all of our lives difficult in lots of places, but can make organizational level analysis attractive.
The incremental thing you can do, though, that's very straightforward, is individuals who voluntarily chose to incur this cost versus individuals that were forced to incur the cost. Yeah. And so you can't separate from that the people who had been there before, and so you don't know why they were forced. Were they forced because they were new, or were they forced because they didn't? You could probably guess because you know how long people are typically there, and you could set. But that takes transaction costs and makes it a little bit more nuanced because you can figure out what's going on.
Do we want to go next?
You were talking about the anonymity and the. You were talking about the anonymity and not knowing who people are, but I'm curious if you're getting your data directly from Wikia or whatever, because I did see the Facebook, login with Facebook, and that could be really
Yeah,
cool.
we're not using it. They don't share that in the public database dumps that they generate.
Not
So
only
this
do they
is
not show this in the public database, it's
Right,
like,
can
it's
you ask
completely,
really nicely?
Yeah, well, we could. They're giving us.
we've got access to a lot of their data now.
They've
more
given us
recently,
access to,
but,
to everything.
that
they
would be
have.
really cool
The
data.
problem is that this is and this is for people that study pre-production. Maybe this is not super surprising. Like the first time I went in and met with them, they glad we're not being recorded. The first time I went in and met with them, as I say to the camera, I was talking to their director of analytics at the time, and we were just completely talking past each other because it turns out that they stop showing ads to people when they log in, and all I was concerned with was production, like people
Editors.
producing things, like editors, contributors to the site, right? Their analytics team was only tracking people who had not logged in, because those are the only people for whom they showed ads.
Interesting.
And as an advertising supported company, as soon as you started to contribute, or even just signed in so that you could contribute, like, I mean, to these wikis.
You fell out of their analytics.
You fell out of their database. So there is a sense in which we could potentially track the people who were not logged in and editing before and afterwards. But they stopped, like, their analytics for tracking users, like, is turned off. Like, for most of them, completely turned off for every logged in contributor to the system.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hayi too. Nate?
I just had a simple question about the method of like the measures for like goodness and contribution.
Yeah, text persistence.
Do you include the text that was reverted?
No.
Because if the reverts go down,
God.
then
I'd have to go check, but I'm pretty sure
then
we
those
cut that.
contributions would also fall out.
So I think the answer is no. We have a measure of I will point you to the existing. We've for the most part we're leveraging a whole bunch of work which has been done on these measures. We didn't develop these measures of text persistence. They've actually been used for probably almost 10 years now in various places and relatively well validated. But we can look at that.
But he's asking if we include reverts in the text persistent measures, and the answer is no.
The answer is no. Yeah.
Yeah, the quick answer is no.
So we don't include identity reverts. So there's different kinds of. That's right. Yeah. But those kinds that take the page back to a position that it was in the past are not included.
Hayi had one. Yeah.
Last question.
Thank you. So very cool study. So I have one question. So have you look at like the long-term effects? So so it seems that once having these features and the contribution decreased by like 50%, that's large. But do you see anything like contribution like an increase afterwards? So it's because I'm asking because it's possible that some people, especially those who already have some experience with Wikia, and they come to site and suddenly find that there is like a new login. They may find, oh, there is some problem of this site, and I will try it later. And after a while, they figure out that this is a permanent feature, so they will decide to kind of maybe log in. So have you looked at like the long-term effects?
So I'll say two things. One is that we have looked at the graphs and they don't look good for that. It doesn't look like it gets better. It actually looks like it gets worse when you look much longer term. One challenge is that we're trying to frame this in terms. One of the things we were trying to do with this was to address what we saw as challenges in the field, at least in terms of the first half of the talk, right? And one of those is about doing causal inference. And the problem with this regression discontinuity design is that your inference is at the moment you flip the switch.
Okay.
Like a week later, we have no inference, right? Like, or it fades into nothing. And so looking at the long-term effect is something we can do, but it's not a place where we can connect that to the causal effect of this particular shock.
I mean, I would say that on the scale of the data that we did look at, though, it does capture. We are modeling the relationships 3 months out, right? And like.
There is a sense.
I can't make causal inferences about the effect of the change out here. I don't feel like that. I don't have the same internal validity if I try to do that. But like, I mean, that's pretty good amount of time, right? If in your scenario, right, if someone was going to kind of come back, I would think that 3 months would be enough for them to come back. And there's no indication from the data we looked at that is a tendency that we observe. So. But I think we have to wrap up. So yeah. Break time. All right. Thank you all very much. Yeah, we'll be here. So.